explored before. But I think upskilling school staff to recognise their vital role and their knowledge of SEN is huge. It underpins everything.
Hello everybody and welcome to the Dyslexia Commission inquiry and our third session. Thank you very much for joining us. I'm Matt Hancock. I'm a passionate advocate of some more support for people who are dyslexic and have other neurodiverse conditions, not least because my frustration with the system and what happens now is born out of my own personal experience, and I try to bring that to bear in making the case on this agenda. I'm incredibly grateful for all of you for joining us today. This has been a very fruitful series of roundtables so far, and there's more to come. We've got 2 hours, and this session is into the SEND review and the schools bill, but I'm also going to open up with the question of funding, which often we kind of park because it's so difficult, but we're going to really open up that box over the next hour or so. I'm also delighted that we're joined by Dr. Helen Ross, who's a trustee of the BDA, and she's going to take over the chair at 1 o'clock. So I'm going to do the first half of the session, and then she's going to chair the second half of the session. And we've also got some excellent panelists who I'm going to turn to in a moment, who are going to give their opening remarks. And then if you have questions, either put your hand up or even better, put your question into the chat. If there aren't any, then I will start the interrogation. But otherwise, I hope we can then have a good discussion and a rounded discussion and an interactive one. That this will very much be about getting the best insights from the wide range of people with the huge amount of experience who are on the call. So that's where I'm coming from. But the question I want to put on the table in the first period of this call is about funding. There's clearly funding that exists for improving provision for children and young people with neurodiverse conditions. But we all know that there's enormous frustrations. And my strong sense is that funding can be better spent. And crucially, that if we get a better education, a better support for people who are dyslexic, then that will obviously have long-term advantages. There are others who say the funding doesn't matter, what matters is the quality of the teaching. I'm sure that both are true. I'm delighted that we also have an observer from the Department for Education on the call and on this theme. So let's, this is one of the most contentious parts of policy in this area. I think we should be, but let's just have an open discussion and debate about it. There are realities to government funding. There's realities to the public purse and the public finances and levels of taxation. The question is what we need to do and what we can do about the problems that we face within those constraints. So we've got an incredible group on from DFE and academic experts and directors of leading neurodiversity organizations and civil society, teachers, researchers. Let's dive in. And I'm going to ask David Williams, who's the Director of Inclusion at Park Academies Trust, to open for 2 to 5 minutes. If everybody else could possibly mute, that would be great. There's a little bit of background noise from a couple of people. But I'm sure it's something that David can cope with. So David, over to you. If you could set out your views in this space and really put in place the context from where you sit for the discussion as a whole. David.
Yes, of course. Thank you and good afternoon, Matt. As Matt just said, I work for the Park Academies Trust. I'm Director of Inclusion. We're an all-through trust. We go from little 3-year-olds starting in nursery and early years right through to 18-year-olds in post-16 education. We've got specialist provision and we've got mainstream provision. So I've got a fairly good understanding. I've also previously worked in residential specialist provision as well. A little bit of background about me, just to give a bit of context. I've been a trustee of the British Dyslexia Association from 2010 till 2020, and I was actually a non-executive joint chair of the board from 2018 to 2020, and I clearly work in the field as my day job. I've got a real interest and understanding of dyslexia, but also how that fits with other neurodiversity, disabilities, so on and so forth. I'm particularly interested in attachment and how social impact complicates the picture for young people. In terms of funding is it's a concept that is different depending on where you are in the country. So and one of the things that I particularly like about the Green Paper is it's talking about bringing that together and almost getting rid of the postcode lottery. Most of our schools are around Swindon based, and what that means is that we've got Wiltshire, Gloucestershire, Oxfordshire, Swindon, all bordering each other, and I've got young people who receive very different amounts of funding depending on where they live in the same provision, sometimes upwards of £10,000 different, just purely on which local authority their home address is in, and quite frankly it's a bit of a nonsense. The other thing that I'm hoping that the Green Paper will address, and it looks like it's going to address, is the complications around the paperwork and the applications for that funding. One of my frustrations, and I know it's agreed with most SENCOs in the country, is that actually applying for high needs funding can be quite a lengthy process. It can be quite a tricky process, and sometimes for some local authorities it's dependent on the parents and how much they're prepared to argue and pressurise, and the mediation process, and unfortunately then tribunal, which is in nobody's interest because it costs an awful lot of money. It's awful lot of time and an awful lot of resource that isn't focused on the children, and it looks like the Green Paper will start to address some of that, which I think is positive. So from the Green Paper's point of view, they're in linking to funding. They're the two areas that I think the change will be beneficial across the whole country. The other area which the Green Paper touches on, and it's interesting, it's the first time alternative provision has been looked at alongside special educational needs. And with 80% of children in alternative provision having a special educational need, I think it's about time. We've been asking for it for a long time, and it's finally there. And from a funding point of view, AP is funded in a very different way to specialist provision and special schools, and drawing all of that together, I think, could really be of benefit. We have a structure in this country where most schools are becoming academies, or they've already become academies. And actually there's a real opportunity to use that academy structure to pool funding to help children and an awful lot of young people with disabilities and difficulties. Just within our own trust, just to give an example, we've opened an early intervention alternative provision, and we've gone from having 5 or 6 pupils supported with the level of funding to over 50 pupils supported, just by bringing it in-house and taking that funding away from private enterprises, really, that were very, very expensive. So there's lots and lots you can do from a trust point of view when schools club together and have a common goal. Right, if I pass across, because I'm conscious there's quite a few of us, that's me.
Thank you very much, David. Thank you for that that summary. So there's some good news in the proposals in the Green Paper, but obviously the current, the differing levels between different local authorities is a significant challenge. We're going to go now to Pamela Hanigan, who's the hello. Would you like to introduce yourself?
My name is Pamela Hanigan, and I began my teaching career in the late 90s in Salford Education Authority, and had a brief break whilst my children were younger, and then the last 19 or so years I've been based in Lancashire, teaching, where my passion for teaching and education in general has grown and grown. I developed a real interest in supporting children with neurodiverse difficulties, and particularly in the area of reading difficulties and phonological awareness difficulties. And for a large part of my teaching career, I've been in areas of social deprivation. And that led me, because there wasn't necessarily the parental capacity there in terms of supporting children, into doing my specialist dyslexia qualification back in 2014. And then I formed LDIGS, which is not a gardening company. It's actually Lancashire Dyslexia Information, Guidance and Support with Rachel Gelder. And we've worked really hard over the last however many years it is to raise the awareness and profile of dyslexia and how that can be supported within the classroom. And that's been done alongside being a part-time class teacher, where I endeavour to practice what I preach, really. So my sort of approach for this is very much, I'm not coming at this from a policymaker angle. I'm coming at it as a coalface worker, and how it's working on the ground, and how I see that in the number of schools, the high number of schools that I go into to support individuals with dyslexia. And I wanted to sort of take this whole idea of funding, and something that I hear a lot of, and I'm going to use a little quote because I like to do these things. Rick Riordan, who wrote the Percy Jackson series, talked about dyslexic children being creative, outside the box thinkers. They have to be, because they don't see or solve problems the same way that other children do. And I think we need to think outside the box in terms of how we approach funding. And with that in mind, I think this idea of expensive screeners and the access to dyslexia specialists and this postcode lottery that's spoken so much about in the SEND review and in the bill, I think we need to perhaps look at the idea of saying, well, do you know what, let's not worry about all teachers doing the SENCO qualification, because that in and of itself is going to be incredibly expensive, incredibly time consuming. You're going to have to release teachers from teaching time, which is what we do best. Is it going to give us the best outcomes? So I realise some people possibly want to punch me for saying that, but that's okay, you can't, because I'm on a camera. But what I think we do need to do, and what we have advocated a huge amount, and what we do ourselves, is upskilling all teachers and upskilling all teaching staff. Anybody who works with a child needs to be upskilled in terms of what they are looking for specifically, in my case, that I'm looking for in terms of dyslexia. So they need to be able to spot those signs, those reading difficulties, the spelling difficulties, challenges with memory, challenges with phonological awareness and processing difficulties, and use their spider senses, know that actually, I think I'm seeing something that could be dyslexia here. We don't need to necessarily give it a label, although we all know, anybody who's worked with people with dyslexia, anybody who's spoken to any adult with dyslexia or young person, it's a really powerful label to be given, because actually it's saying, do you know what, I'm empowered by this because my brain works differently. I'm not stupid, I'm not slow, I'm not lazy. This is the reason. So I think we need to upskill all teaching staff, all TAs, and then allow teaching staff to do what they do best. They know their children and they can have that holistic approach. Look at those children. So many children have got neurodiverse difficulties, and there's a huge number of neurodiverse difficulties that have got that comorbidity. But we always say, when we're looking at individuals, whether that's in my own setting or it's within the schools that we go into, what's causing the greatest barrier to learning right now? And that's where the support needs to be placed at that moment. And I think that a big part of this, and that idea of uniformity that's spoken about in both the bill and in the SEN review, is that actually the idea of universal screening would actually be a really good, a much better route for the funding, because actually you could identify those children and identify them early. It's not going to give you a diagnosis, but the diagnosis itself is not necessarily necessary. It's the support needs to be put in place, and the earlier that we can get that support in place, the better. I have no idea how long I've been talking now. It feels like I've been talking for about 3.5 hours.
Keep going.
One more point. And my other point is, I think that we do need to have some form of screening, but also there are other things out there, other technologies. We work quite closely with a company called Lexplore, and Lexplore do an artificial intelligence reading assessment. And this is amazing from the point of view that it's standardized, it's validated and reliable, and it's actually looking at the reading of all children across the board, which segues me beautifully into the Cambridge County Council, I think it is, their approach. They've got a universal support through dyslexia-friendly classrooms. And I think all good teachers, anybody who's a teacher out there will know that when there's really good ideas, you've got to nick them. And I think that Cambridge seems to have got a really fantastic approach to difficulties with reading. And they're saying, do you know what? The label doesn't matter. Any child that is struggling with reading, let's get in there, let's support them early, and also make sure that that support is there wider. Don't know if I've gone off tangent there. I'll shut up.
Well, you've Pamela, that has been a successive slaying of the sacred cows. I'm going to ask André Imich from the department to come in a minute. You're an observer, and we respect that status, but there's lots to comment on. But I just before I do, I'm really interested in two of the things that you said, which are quite edgy. One is we don't need to have SEND qualifications for all teachers. What matters is the upskilling to be able to have a positive attitude towards getting the best out of each child, essentially, as opposed to a SEND qualification specific. And then this argument that you need universal screening, but don't then necessarily need to do the official diagnosis, which is often the really expensive part. And I'm really interested in that, because that is and your reason behind that. So could I just ask you that, and then also Angela Fawcett's asked you to repeat the name of the AI.
Oh, sorry.
So if you could just address those, and then I'll turn to André from the department.
Thank you. So apologies if I have been controversial, and please nobody come and find me on that point of view. But I do stand by that. I don't think that there is a need for the SENCO qualification. With everybody speaking to head teachers who've done the SENCO qualification, they've actually commented that it actually helped them in terms of their leadership role more than it helped in terms of their understanding and the day-to-day working with children with special educational needs. I think there's an awful lot of there's an incredible amount of goodwill, there's an incredible amount of good understanding and knowledge. I think the vast majority of teachers that I work with very closely know their children, they know their successes, and they know the areas of difficulty, and we need to target those. And I think that time and money could be wasted in focusing on having that qualification. Yes, you do need the upskilling. And then I can't remember the other question, sorry.
This point which Helen Ross has also picked up in the chat, which is the distinction between the screening, which could lead to data on picking up the children who are struggling to read, and then the official diagnosis. I think that's a really thought-provoking insight.
Yeah, I think that as part of my qualification, I am a qualified under assessor for dyslexia. When I go in to do an assessment with an individual, that will take pretty much a full day of assessment. It can run over a couple of sessions depending on the individual. It might be that they've got an attention difficulty, so that will, we'll do that over more sessions if that's what's needed. Then it will take a good day to analyse those results, to bring all that information together, and then to write a hefty report where I have to come down one side or the other about whether that person has got dyslexia or has not got dyslexia, and come up with recommendations for that. And absolutely that makes a world of difference to individuals. But that takes a lot of time, and ultimately that then costs money. I think if you can do a screening, we do what we call the mid-range assessment. Say again, sorry. Yeah, an advanced screening assessment, which includes, we use the Nessie screener, which I'm sure many people are aware of. We do find that in and of itself, we think it's a fabulous screener, but actually it does need that specialist knowledge, which teachers could be upskilled to spot, to know what you're looking for when that individual, has that individual used a huge number of strategies to actually be able to answer in the way that they have answered. Are they absolutely exhausted that day? Is it that actually they've been working with a specialist teacher and have done lots of work on memory strategies, so they've got that toolkit? So I think you need to know what you're looking for. This is not a case of saying, right, let's get that class of 32 and sit them in front of a computer and let them get on with it.
Yeah.
It's got to be more than that. There's got to be that understanding behind it, and there's got to be that observation.
Okay, thank you. I'm going to bring in David Williams and Helen Ross, who've also been commenting in the chat, and then go to André. David.
Yes, so the proposal isn't for all teachers to be trained as SENCOs. I think there was a bit of a confusion around that in the questioning. What the proposal is to change the National SENCO qualification to make it an NPQ level qualification. So at the moment it sits at a master's level and is worth about 60 credits. Towards a master's. The NPQ would be a slightly different level, and it would bring it in line with the courses that you do to become a head teacher or executive head teacher, etc., etc. I personally, my gut feeling is that we need to make sure that there is academic rigour in the qualification. I'm indifferent as to where it should sit, but I think it needs to be more practical and have more hands-on knowledge around things like assessments and screenings that you've just described. I think we should be screening every child, and within our trust we screen every child in every school in our trust every year, because actually that's the best way to make sure that we're not letting children drop through the net. And we've all taught, those that have been teaching a while, we've all taught that well-behaved girl in year 9 who works really, really hard and sits really, really quietly, and then towards the middle of the year you discover that she's copying from her friend next door, and actually screening stops that being an issue.
I'd second what David said as well. David alerted me to this yesterday. I'll give you the credit because you reminded me, and I spent a lot of time reading. I spent yesterday evening reading through the green paper because it matters. I would second what you said about the SENCO qualification. I have mine. It was brilliantly done, and I think it's really important to address the fact, and we chatted briefly before, didn't we, Jane, about how there's no solid input, there's no framework was the word I was looking for earlier. There's no solid, clear framework for ITE input or ITT input around SEN. So some unis, I went to Sheffield Hallam, it was absolutely fantastic, really good uni, brilliant provision, very, very well done. I can't speak to other unis, but while there's no clear, you've got to do X, Y, Z, well, people are kind of going to make it up as they go along. That's human, they will do their best, I'm sure. But we need solid, consistent frameworks. So yeah, that was my comment on the training of teachers. It needs to be all teachers, very robust. But AMDA is completely outside all of those boxes, and that's a different kettle of fish. But I'll shut up now.
Terrific, thank you, Helen. André, so we came into this discussing funding, but whereas normally conversations not relating to funding migrate towards the funding question, we have actually migrated away into the broader consequence of it. But I'd love if you could comment on all of that and explain where the DFE is up to.
Yeah, thanks, Matt. In fact, I am just an observer, so I'm not going to say very much, Matt. I'm sure you'll appreciate that position. But you started there just by saying, I was fascinated as well that you threw in a question about funding, and it didn't last very long. It moved in a different direction, which is quite interesting, I think. but maybe we'll come back to it. I'm sure we will. But I mean, I just want to say, I mean, I think, this early dialogue so far shows, the really diverse range of views there are in the field that we in the department are dealing with. We've had a massive response to the Green Paper. So thank you to everyone who's contributed. I'm sure everyone here today has, but it's been massive. We are continuing to go through it, but inevitably we're getting quite a lot of sort of extreme views coming forward. We have to manage all of those. And so, it's quite a challenge bringing the SEN sector together to a shared vision. But actually, it's been encouraging what I've heard so far. I mean, firstly, a lot of the proposals have already been mentioned, and they've been mentioned favourably. And the overall ambition that David was articulating to reduce the postcode lottery and ensure there is a much more consistent experience, both for families and for schools and colleges and other providers, I think, that's something that we certainly want to look out for. It's a challenge knowing which direction to go in when you look at the detail of that, isn't it? I can see David smiling at that. But I think, and again, very much a focus on, we certainly want to drive an agenda where children access support quickly through good early identification without necessarily needing a label. And I think it was interesting here about the Cambridgeshire example that Rachel was referring to. So I'll pause there, Matt. Some reflections so far.
Thank you very much. I wonder whether we could bring in Angela Fawcett, who's been commenting repeatedly in the chat, on exactly that question that André was pointing out. My personal reflection is that actually, although of course there are firm views strongly held, there is more of a potential for a synthesis here than there has been for a long time, because ultimately we all care about the same thing, which is high quality reading, and a combination of screening plus training so that screening can be properly used, and then diagnosis being done appropriately, and something that is offered to those who the screening with the smart interpretation by a trained teacher implies needs to be done. There is a good outcome there that actually takes will take a large proportion of the informed SEN stakeholder views with it. I think there is I'm getting more and more of a synthesis since the publication of the Green Paper than a divergence, if you see what I mean. Angela.
Yeah, so I'd like to totally agree with you there, Matt, because I think early screening is the key. If you identify problems before a child actually fails, then you have the opportunity to make sure they're not destroyed by that failure. Because once they've failed, well, you know yourself, it's very difficult to pull yourself up, to actually make yourself fit into the classroom and keep up with everyone. So you don't just have your dyslexia, you have the added impact of failure. If we can prevent that failure, then it may be that we don't actually need to diagnose everybody, that people will get the support they need from very constructive, very supportive teachers, and that as they go forward, it's recognised that they're struggling, but they provide the support, and it may not be that every child needs to end up with an expensive diagnosis. So it's what I would like to see, that it becomes every child's right to get that support they need and to be recognised, particularly that quiet child who was copying all the time, because I've met so many of those, particularly the girls, who just keep their heads down and nobody really notices. And sometimes they're not even identified until they get to university. So it's really important. So I'd like to endorse everything you've said, and really everything that's been said today. Very important meeting.
David.
So I think this is quite an exciting conversation and an exciting point in time, really. One of the issues at the moment is that some local authorities allow schools and trusts to access high needs funding outside of statutory assessment. Some local authorities don't allow that. And what that means is that some local authorities are in essence stopping you being able to apply for small pots of money to use for early intervention, as it were. So we all know about the notional SEN, which is £6,000 per child. But if you want to spend more than that, actually, we shouldn't have to be putting our SENCOs through a year of application. They should be able to access the funding quickly, because during that year, the child slips further behind. And actually, it's a lot cheaper to put the support in place early so that they can then progress further forward. I'm also really interested in the Green Paper. It talks about a single system for healthcare, local government, education from a financial point of view. And I wonder around commissioning how that will work, because at the moment, the legal responsibility of an EHCP, of an education healthcare plan, sits squarely on education, and it doesn't, I mean, you have to have medical directors and so on and so forth, but it sits with the education team really, and it's coming out of the high needs funding pots. And I'm particularly interested to see whether or not we actually will start all working together, education, health and care, because I think that really would drive benefit quite early in the system, and there's an awful lot of expertise that could be shared between the services and costs saved.
I have to say that as Health Secretary, I've really worried about the health systems engagement in EHCPs, because I thought that the inclusion of health, I think it was in the 2014 Care Act, but was a big step forward, but I hadn't seen all that much evidence of it on the ground, because within the silos, because the budget was all over in the other department and in local authorities, getting the NHS to engage on it was really, really problematic. Anyway, unfinished business. Can I pick up though on your first point, which brings us back to the funding, because it's all, I'm going to challenge you, because it's all very well saying the SENCO should be able to say, well, you know, we need such and such support for this individual. But there's also a fixed pot, and notwithstanding a wider debate about the level of education funding and the very strong correlation between investment in education and future success of the country. But let's just park that, because I'm sure we're all on the same side of that argument, including the department, no doubt. But but within a fixed budget, you know, that you can't just say, well, if a SENCO phones up, then they should be able to get extra cash. Can you? And can I bring that back also to the diagnosis point? Because I think we've had a very interesting conversation about the importance of screening the data and the trained interpretation of that data. But of course, diagnosis does bring potential for both funding and changes to exam conditions, you know, which are both benefits to either the school and pupil. And so we shouldn't be naive to the consequences of the diagnosis. You know, policy rests on these diagnoses, and in my experience in government and public services, when more money comes because you go through a particular hoop, suddenly going through that hoop becomes more attractive. So what did you mean in practice there, David? And I'm going to bring in Helen Ross to check whether what you said is sensible.
So right. To answer the funding question, did you want me to answer on the funding question?
You go first and then Helen. Yeah.
Thank you. So in essence, it depends on a number of factors within schools. So what I was saying about high needs funding is some local authorities, you can apply for pots of money to do projects or to run interventions outside of an education healthcare plan. Some local authorities you can't. And the issue at the moment with school funding, and this is why actually lots of schools should be joining trusts, is that if you're a school that's maybe struggled with Ofsted, you've got a falling roll, you're struggling with your intake numbers, and maybe you've got a high degree of children who are sitting just above the poverty level, actually finance is really, really tough for those schools. Whereas if you're a school that's sat with their pan full, so they've got every child in their school they should have, and they've got a number of children who are in the poverty level, then they're getting significantly more funding. So what I was saying about the notional SEN is, for some schools, it's more than possible to find £6,000 per child on the SEN register. For some schools, the money just isn't there, and it's largely determined by the local area that they're in and whether or not they've got a falling or a growing role. And if you don't have that funding, your only option is to go to a high needs funding pot if you're a standalone school. And if your local authority won't allow you to access it without an education health care plan, then schools are applying for EHCPs, and actually what they really need is £2,000-3,000. Well, an EHCP might cost £8,000 to get the EHCP. So it's a very inefficient way to access that funding. I'm not saying they should just phone up and be able to ask for the money and get given the money. There should be a process for it. But for some schools, they really do need that money. If they're in multi-academy trusts, to a degree, it will solve that problem because some funding can be shared. And I understand that it's far more complex than I just described, and there's lots of funding streams within education, and it differs whether you're an academy or a mainstream school, etc., etc. But roughly, that's what I was saying. From the point of view of diagnosis for exam arrangements,
that was what I was going to talk. Yeah. A label, even for an EHCP, nominally, you don't need a diagnosis. In Wiltshire, they like to have like ed psych input, but they never diagnose here. And our team are really good in Wiltshire. They're lovely, brilliant, good professionals. And there's a lot of people saying in the chat that for university access, you'll need an assessment. 9 times out of 10, yes, and it needs to be a particular type of assessment. So there's not one flavour of assessment per se. But I think it needs to be very clear that it's within the school system, it's needs-based, and within the FE system, it's nebulous. It's so nebulous. Somebody popped me a message on LinkedIn earlier from Philip Ruddock. He popped me a message saying that, FE, yes, nominally funding is attached to 0 to 25 within the Code of Practice and all the rest of it. But none of us have said the word college. Nobody. I'm not an expert on college funding at all. I cannot speak to it, but I know it's a faff. Normal way of working, access arrangements, it's an absolute faff. So Matt, you may be better placed to answer this, or anybody else, another. What about FE funding? Because it's just a substantial area of unclarity.
Pam.
Apologies there. Rachel was trying to unmute me with the mouse button, and I was trying to do it on the mouse pad. So many hands does not always make light work. I've not got experience of higher education funding. What I do think I was following the chat then, and I'm clearly not very good at multitasking there. But I think that it is that fact that actually you don't need a diagnosis of dyslexia to actually get extra time, and that can be right down to primary school level for SATs as well as for GCSE, and those extra support using assistive technology. It needs to be the normal way of working for that individual, so that can be with assistive technology. And also, we really wanted to try and make that point that actually just basically with a diagnosis of dyslexia, you will not get an EHC plan pushed through if there's other neurodiverse difficulties, but even then, it tends to be at a much lower level. But support can be put in place, including, like I said, the extra time and things like that. Ultimately, it would be great if we could do full diagnostic assessments on every individual that we do have those concerns about. I don't know how realistic that is, but I think that upskilling of everybody working with young people and then putting that correct support in place. And I think I wanted to make the point as well that with the dyslexia-friendly classroom, I've put it in the chat, I'm talking here almost in a soft way, dyslexia-friendly classroom, not necessarily accredited. The accreditation by the BDA is fabulous, but actually I believe I've got a dyslexia-friendly classroom. We don't have accreditation because we're a very small school, and we just can't afford to actually to get that accreditation. And I've possibly not answered the question again, sorry.
Terrific. You definitely did. Thank you. I'm going to go to Georgina, who's got a hand up.
Thank you. It was just about the point about screening and giving you the diagnosis and that sort of thing. And I just wanted to say that I completely agree with the upskilling of teachers and that side of things, and screening. I think that's very important. We can find out children that need extra help. But I do still stand by that, even though the diagnoses do cost a lot of money, they are so important for the child themselves to understand themselves. And I get that it's so expensive, and I don't know the way around that, and funding isn't my expertise, but I just think for the child, as they are going through school and understanding themselves, for their mental health and well-being, and just for everything for them, that diagnosis means so much. And it's important when they're going from one school to another as well. You might have a fantastic primary school that the screener picks up that this child's got some reading difficulties, we're going to give them some extra support, and the school might be fantastic. But then when they go to secondary school, what happens if it's not as good, and what happens if they get missed? I've had messages last night from one parent who said exactly this, that at primary school they had a diagnosis for dyslexia, but for some reason this wasn't passed on to secondary school, and this child tried to commit suicide because they felt so misunderstood. They actually were told in the first few weeks of secondary school to read out loud in front of their peers that they'd never met. And obviously it was written previously that they shouldn't be doing things like that. And that child was in such a crisis after just the first few weeks of secondary school. So for me, the diagnosis, I think, is incredibly important so that they understand themselves, and their mental health and well-being doesn't get affected too much by it.
Thank you for sharing that story. I totally agree with you about the importance of for a child, and indeed an adult, of understanding yourself, and the availability of diagnosis. I think that one of the things that has really strengthened in the discussion around this recently and around the Green Paper is the importance of the screening step, if you like. But I think it's really important that we don't say that that is an alternative to, but actually can lead to a higher quality targeting of resources for diagnostic assessments. One of the things that really strikes me, and that the department have brought to light, is that there is a strong U-shaped relationship between socioeconomic background and your likelihood of having a diagnostic assessment, and that can't be valid in the real world. You could understand that there might be a socioeconomic correlation, but the idea that those with diagnostic assessments are highly concentrated at both the bottom and top end of the socioeconomic spectrum is an extremely hard piece of data to explain with any universal or genuine setup. It's much more likely that it's simply that because they're expensive, people at the top end pay for far more assessments and are more likely, therefore, to get an assessment which should be available to people across the socioeconomic spectrum. And this is a social injustice that comes from the current system, as well as the economic and the educational failure from the lack of diagnosis. So I think for me, the universal and fair access to the diagnostic assessment for those who genuinely need them, as identified through universal screening, has a really important social fairness aspect to it as well. Sorry, I didn't intend to go on that rant, but I feel it very strongly. David.
Yeah, I just wanted to say I 100% agree with your rant, and I've not heard many other people saying that before. I've also noticed that if you look at high needs funding, so children with EHCPs, that also sits at both ends of the socioeconomic spectrum. In essence, if the parents have got the wherewithal and the financial resource to fight at mediation and go to tribunal, they will get an EHCP. And if the child is, to be blunt, struggling with social, emotional, mental health and causing lots of issues in the school and receiving permanent and fixed term suspensions and permanent exclusions, they will get an EHCP. The students that sit in the middle, where the parents are possibly illiterate, it's not fought for. And it mirrors exactly what Matt's just said. So I think it was a point well made.
Right. Okay. Well, look, we've had a broad discussion that has ended up much broader than funding. And what I'd summarise from that is that there is a very warm welcome to the proposal of ending postcode lottery. But there's still a lot more to do, not least because of the very limited resources available to diagnostics, and the way that, because of the partly private provision of diagnostics, the fairness around this, and the whole point of universal education is that we should give people the support that they need, and that is undoubtedly not yet being achieved. So thank you very much for that. I'm now going to hand over the chair to Helen to chair the next session. I think, André, maybe just before doing so, can I put you on the spot? I don't expect you to comment, and also you have a brand new Secretary of State, so you won't yet have been able to take his mind, although I have. And he has a dyslexic child, so just we're in, that's as far as I got with him in the lift when we're on our way to meet the King. But we're going to have a longer discussion. But so we all understand why you're constrained in terms of what you can say, and there's been a lot of change. But I'd be very interested in any reflections you are able to share with us, and then I'll hand over the chair to Helen for the next segment.
Yes, I mean, I think, as you say, we've got a changing ministerial team as well as a changing Secretary of State. So that will be of interest and relevance to this agenda. But I think we haven't really explored the existing systems, particularly in the school system, for identifying literacy difficulties. And there are a number of those. For example, the early years foundation stage assessments, the phonics screening check, key stage 1 assessments, although I know they're changing, key stage 2 assessments. I mean, I, like everyone, was dismayed at the story that one of you described of a young child coming in and being made to read in front of their peers. That seemed to be an issue about transition and information exchange, which is highlighted in the Green Paper as something we do need to improve upon. That seemed to me to be more about that rather than their diagnosis. But we haven't really heard much about the existing systems and why you feel that they're not robust enough, because all of those assessment systems do have very strong focus on emerging literacy, emerging early reading skills and literacy skills.
Thank you very much. Thank you all for participation in that session. I'll hand over to you, Helen.
And full disclosure, I do private dyslexia assessments amongst the various bits and bobs I do to pay my mortgage. In an ideal world, that I wouldn't do it. I'd do it under the local authority. Private assessments wouldn't exist. And anyone who knows me knows that's my stance. I need to pay the mortgage. Kids need to understand themselves. I'm a little bit dismayed. I think the fact that there's been an SEN review, the amount of noise and upset around SATs in general, the phonics check doesn't tell people that they're dyslexic. It says they might be wobbly on phonics. The reasons behind being wobbly on phonics are a myriad. My little boy gets talked at 10 to the dozen. We've never done baby talk. That's because me and Mr. Dr. Ross just talk. If you have someone where their English is an additional language, they're going to have a different set of phonics, not the wrong one. If you speak Spanish, you have different phonics because it's a different language. So there's a whole myriad of reasons. It doesn't necessarily highlight dyslexia. The thing that needs to be looked at, and people do look at, and schools do, is the assess, plan, do, review cycle. So that's where kids' actual needs start to become identified. There is no national way of identifying dyslexia because it's all localized to local authorities. So that is a problem. We've highlighted that's a problem. The CTF files, well, I always tell parents to send them through because the reliability is like a chocolate fire guard. So that's a transition problem. I love a chocolate fire guard. And SATs, well, where kids do SATs and CATs, if you have a neurodiverse profile, the notion that you can extrapolate GCSE attainment from that, problematic. So I have a lot of opinions that I don't keep to myself. So yeah, I think it's quite problematic. On to the next session anyway. I will try and keep to time. We're a little bit short of time. One of our speakers from this session Sadly, David Dyslexia, I believe is how to say it. If I've said it wrong, I am sorry, because people's names matter. He sadly can't be here today. There's been a change of circumstances, so we wish him well and hope everything is okay with him and his setting. In this element of the session, we are going to talk about kind of accountability. So who's accountable for what? Who's got to do what to meet kids' needs, is basically we're looking at. There's classroom teachers. We've talked about the kind of training we'd have for them already. SENCO, their role, and the kind of the model of the SENCO qualification. We touched on AMDA. I may bring back to that and the other level 7 equivalents. We'll see how discussion moves. And we've got some amazing expertise. So we have Jane Bradley from Chester University. I had a little Google of everybody yesterday, and Jane is phenomenally accomplished. She's at, as I said, Chester University now. Previously, she's worked in PRU, so pupil referral units and alternate provision. She's worked in primaries and secondary, so she's brilliant. And following that, we'll bring in Rachel, who's with Pamela up in Lancashire. And she is from LDIGS, that is not a gardening service. I love that. So Jane, could you share sort of your thoughts around accountability and the roles of who should do what in schools? Because we briefly touched on that before. I'll mute as well. So
yeah, we did. Thank you. Yeah, I've got some slides here. I think I was asked to just put a few slides together. So yeah, just my background is very varied. I come from a teaching background and have been at the university, and I've led on the MA SEND and SENCO, and now I'm leading on the attachment trauma and mental health. So that's my sort of area of specialism, really. And I also lead on the BA special educational needs. So if you can move on with the slides, that'd be great. So when we're talking about accountability, and we're looking at the SEND review and the green paper, these are the sort of key points really that I pulled out when we're looking at that accountability issue. And firstly, I think that consistency of offer is essential. So making sure that schools and settings are all offering, similar provision, and the school information reports, they need to be accessible and consistent across schools, authorities, and the national landscape. And we need to include making those compulsory in independent and post-16 schools. And it was interesting to hear the comments around post-16 provision and, potentially, that being a gap. We need to ensure that funding formula is fair and equitable. And again, we need independent schools to be included in that funding formula. Otherwise, we have a competitive market with high cost placements. And that certainly, from the work that I'm doing currently across some local authorities and multi-academy trusts, that is definitely happening. The proposed local SEND partnerships that are proposed, what do these actually look like, and can they help support with the training of teachers and that upskilling that we were talking about to better meet the needs of learners? There's also the proposed standardised digitalised format of the education healthcare plans, and that would hopefully support improving the consistency of provision across the country, because currently those education healthcare plans are in different formats, and if you move authorities, and if any of you have worked across authorities, that's problematic, and that will help professionals develop consistency and equal standards. We need to ensure that there's parity of placement, so we need to make sure that we've got settings that have got inclusive reputations should not be overloaded with learners with additional needs. We've got situations where many children move to particular settings because they are inclusive settings, and that then has an impact on the funding in those settings, and we need to make sure that we mitigate against that. And as we've talked about already, we've got to make sure that early intervention is key, and all professionals need the skills to be able to identify the difficulties early and put in place targeted intervention. And, you know, we were talking about that diagnosis, and actually that would help with that early intervention, and it would help professionals manage that. So if you can just move slides for me, that would be great. There's also, with the schools bill, there's a focus on attendance and the statutory guidance on attendance, and it talks about the processes of support in place. And there needs to be a much bigger focus on the upskilling knowledge of professionals around things like attachment and trauma, and that can potentially be linked to diagnoses and things like that. I've worked with many children that just their difficulties in themselves becomes can be traumatic. And if we think about it from a theoretical point of view, you know, the medical approach is very much to put in systems, but the social model approach is to understand the reasons for poor attendance and address those underlying causal factors rather than deal with consequences. So professionals, I'm coming back to the same point, I think, need those skills to be able to identify difficulties earlier. The new suggested MPQ SENCO award, should it be mandatory for all professionals? But I think we've talked about that situation, and it's about upskilling professionals, but actually having an award that is there for leaders of SEND. The current SENCO award is very reflective and critical, and as somebody has said in the chat already, it's that level 7, it's that master's award. And, you know, my questions are, will the same levels of reflection be achieved? And do we need to consider a further award to support the coaching and mentoring of SENCOs into roles? And that's something that we offer as a university. The leadership of SEND is key. So the SENCOs who've completed the national award often means they're often the most qualified professional in a school with that level 7 qualifications, and they often champion the support for learners. And the most inclusive schools always tend to have a leader who has a SEND qualification. So I'm a real advocate of having, at the very least, the MPQ or the equivalent of the SENCO being mandatory for all school leaders, because that makes a real difference in terms of providing inclusive education. And then my final point is about, we've already talked about this already, is about that SEND training and initial teacher training. And it needs to be increased, and there needs to be clear mandatory expectations and monitoring for providers. The numbers of SEND nationally, the numbers are increasing. So professionals need that greater knowledge to support the needs of a growing number of SEND pupils, particularly those, and that's including learners with dyslexia. So SEND qualifications for initial teacher training should be made mandatory. So those are my thoughts with regards to accountability. Thanks, Helen.
I literally, as you were speaking, I was scribbling, and then you've jolly well addressed all the points I've written down. So thank you. Can we hear, please, from Rachel of LDIGS in Lancashire? What are your thoughts? Quick introduction and your thoughts on accountability and kind of how it should work.
Quick introduction, a little bit about me, is my career path's been a little bit different in that I worked for a long time in the NHS and specialised eventually in mental health. So I kind of feel like it's all come full circle, because as an associate SENCO in schools, my health background that actually does give me quite a lot of knowledge and experience to be able to kind of juggle lots of different things and health and education. But then I kind of moved north up to Lancashire and worked in schools and had a really supportive head teacher who supported me to do the dyslexic specialist teacher qualification, which I did. And, you know, LDIGS was kind of born out of that desire to help more children. And I suppose our work has evolved over the years. So we do assessments, we do sort of the varying levels of assessments right the way through, but we always also work with a lot of schools, kind of providing support to them in terms of making school more dyslexia friendly, in terms of working with more children. And I suppose I feel really lucky that I'm able to work as a SENCO in a school. So I know the challenges that schools are facing, particularly in trying to support children appropriately. But equally, I kind of see it from the other side in terms of the advice and support that we offer. So that's a bit of a background about me. So as I've already said, I wear two hats. So I'm working in schools and I'm well aware of those challenges faced in supporting children. And as a specialist, I'm really aware of the level of support that children with dyslexia and similar difficulties need in order to reach the full potential, I guess. And one thing I'm sure of is that achieving both of those is incredibly difficult within the resources that we've actually got. And I think the SEN review concluded that there is a need for much greater consistency in how those needs are identified. And that national funding formula is equally important in terms of increasing that fairness and to ensure schools have an equal amount of funding across the country. And it can be very different even across a county. In the area that I work in, we have Lancashire as a local authority, but Blackpool actually falls outside of that. So one of the schools that I work in, we have a Blackpool child in a Lancashire school, but the funding process is entirely different. And the amount of money that that child brings to school is entirely different. And yet, you know, there's no difference really geographically. So I think making that parity is really, really important. And I think David, you made the point about how schools' resources are targeted towards those children with EHCs. And as a SENCO, it is very difficult because you have all those boxes to tick, all those children who have EHCs. And at one point I was in a very average size school and we had 12 EHC plans or 12 children with EHCs. So you're trying to juggle that together with all those children who have those SPLD type difficulties. So it's about juggling those resources. And I think the SEN review also highlighted that the vast majority of children should be in mainstream settings. That's the best place for them to have their education. And that's generally the case for children with dyslexia and other, you know, similar difficulties. But the support that those children receive is often lacking and patchy, and it leaves them feeling really frustrated and lost. And that leads to those SEMH difficulties that Georgina was talking about and behavioural needs. And that's where the mainstream school might become unstuck and that kind of relationship breaks down. So it's about supporting those children right from the early stages so that frustration isn't increased. So that early identification is paramount to the success of those children who need to learn differently. Because let's face it, there's a lot of children, not just dyslexic children, there's a lot of children who need to learn differently. And teachers and TAs generally really know their children. And as Pam said earlier, that's the first stage of that early identification. It's that trusting your spider senses and an educator and investigating that further. So screening is obviously a great way forward for that. But I think the only caveat I would put on that is that schools screen in a similar way, so that we're comparing apples with apples when children do transfer to different schools. But equally, the point that Pam made earlier about staff being trained in what to look for in terms of that qualitative data, as well as that quantitative data you get from the report at the end of it. And using other technologies, you know, using other aspects, like we talked about, like SLAW before. But I think upskilling school staff to recognise their vital role and their knowledge of SEN is huge. It underpins everything. So that initial teacher training needs to incorporate it. We've talked about all this before. But equally, teachers and TAs need to know that where they can make a real difference. You know, things that they can do on an everyday basis that really makes the difference to those children. And those things don't actually require huge amounts of time, resources, or funding. So, and what I think we said before, what's put in place for those dyslexic children is going to benefit all children.
Absolutely, I totally agree with that. And I think it just, the only reason I raised the capital letters dyslexia friendly schools thing is because I happened to be evaluating it in Wiltshire.
Yeah.
I was sat at a table at a time and said, I can do that. But I think you're planning on.
Yeah.
For their sins, they've let me do it. But it's the notion of a dyslexia friendly and an inclusive classroom. I think it's a lady, Nicola, raised it on the chat as well. I think what I would really like to draw on, and you said like you felt that things had gone full circle, and honestly, like a big watch of my study work from when I came down to Wiltshire was around sort of the implementation of the 2014 Children and Families Act, and it feels like we're going back. We were supposed to be freed from the constraints of local authority, which in principle isn't necessarily a bad thing, but it brings inconsistencies. So I totally I align with that. And I think somebody, and I cannot begin to say who said about consistency of screening, and I've discussed it, we've discussed it at meetings at the BDA, we've discussed it in Wiltshire with Caroline, who's on the call today, and Caroline Folk, is how do we know a screen is any good? And I think as part of the accountability, and I'd actually be quite keen to hear from André on this, because there are bajillions of different screeners. Some are great, some not so much. So I think a really important thing around the accountability, because if schools are to be screening children, they're accountable for educational progress, they're accountable for record keeping and all the rest. Who's accountable for validating and sanctioning the screeners? I feel that should be a DFE thing, maybe, if that's what's expected. Can you give your thoughts on that, please, André?
I mean, our main line is that schools are accountable for outcomes, and that's right and proper. And what we expect is that they do have a degree of freedom about how they adapt their teaching and learning processes to meet the national curriculum requirements and examination requirements and so on. And again, we've heard today from a number of people in this room, at least 2 or 3, that they are doing screening effectively in their schools. Now, I think that's right and proper if they judge that to be right and are getting good outcomes. So they're using a tool to achieve outcomes. The outcomes will be the sort of accountability element of whether they've chosen good screening assessment tools that have led to children making good progress. So I do think the focus on outcomes is right, and that's a national focus. The degrees of freedom at local level, I think, are ones that by and large schools welcome. There are inconsistencies, as has been made clear here, across schools and across local authorities. But I think the proposals in the Green Paper, such as the development of those local partnerships and a local inclusion plan, are in part designed to pull that together and drive much greater consistency of practice, as well as the opportunity for greater challenge within local areas.
I am going to bring you back though, and I'm going to quote you now. You said a good screener. Define good. And who is accountable? You talked about outcomes, but identification of need, schools are accountable for that. I wasn't, until I was 17, I was diagnosed as dyslexic, and I spent years feeling thick. The mental health impact on me, and I'm really, really robust. I'm lucky. Not every child has the background I do. I've said it before and I'll say it again. So I'd like to bring you back to the question of what is a good screener, because that's the word you used. Who decides? And how because when I think about this, the SSP, this systematic phonics, there is a list of what is defined as good by the DFE. If schools are free to deviate from that, but in reality, there's funding tied. I'm going to finish. There's funding tied to that. So if schools are accountable for screening and identifying need, and if there is a bill to say schools are going to screen, who is going to decide what is a good screener? That is, I'm sorry, but that is a question that matters. This is not the first forum where I have had this question raised. I've heard it across the board.
I think one of the challenges we have is that, and this is a good one to throw into this, there is no national agreement about what dyslexia is. And I think that in itself, it raises a big challenge.
Look at the BDA website, what is dyslexia, and the Rose Report in 2009.
We have done, and that's a very strong view, but there are other views as well. And there are quite a lot of very hefty, challenging debates, aren't there, about this issue? So if there isn't universal agreement on what is dyslexia, then there's going to be a challenge in terms of getting universal agreement on what is a screening tool to identify dyslexia. We can certainly get closer to it.
Okay.
But I do think that the focus on teaching and learning and then looking at the outcomes is the right one. And schools will make their own judgment, guided by information on the BDA website, for example.
Mm-hmm. But again, I'll bring you back to SSP then. Schools can freely choose what they like. But I just think, we're not going to resolve this now, but I think it's really important that we have it considered, that we need to, and Rachel said the Rose report was government. So just that we need to have an understanding of how schools identify what is a good screener. I think, David, you've got your hand up, go for it. I'll mute myself so that you can.
Yeah, I just wanted to say, within our trust, we've got different schools. Some of our schools are using different screeners to each other. And I'm a little bit indifferent which one they choose to use, as long as they're getting good outcomes from that screening. Most of them have got standardised scores. From what I can see, the difference really is how easy it is to administer, and actually I don't mind which ones the schools use. For me, it's more about checking that the students are making progress, and if they're not making progress, why aren't they making progress, and then putting interventions into place to support that. And also remembering that actually as young people get older, they may suddenly show up on a screener where they haven't 3, 4, 5 years earlier, particularly with girls, where actually they without getting into the science behind how the brain works, but particularly with girls where they develop coping strategies far more easily and more readily than boys. Actually, quite often girls don't get a diagnosis and they wouldn't show up on a screening tool until they're hitting kind of mid-teen years or potentially even older. So it's not about a one-off screening for me, it's about regular screening. But actually which screening tool we use, I'm indifferent to.
Thank you, David. That's really interesting. Brian, you had your hand raised. Go for it.
Just a quick reassurance for André. I don't want to speak for them, but I've been engaged as one of the advisors on a SAST process, which has been looking at the definition of dyslexia for about 1.5 years now. Without wanting to jinx the whole process, and some of the other people on this call have as well, I think the sector is moving towards some level of consensus, not complete unanimity by any means, and there's been a massive debate, but I think you probably could look forward to something that at least is going to deliver what hopefully will be a very good working definition that will take at least most people in the sector along with it, not all, and that's never going to happen, but that, you know, there might be some reassurance coming on that point.
Thank you, Brian. I can see Angela's got her, Rachel and Pamela, bear with me a moment. Angela's got her hand up, so literally so go for it.
Hi, I agree with what's just been said, but what the key point in a screener, and I should confess, of course, that I have my own screeners. It's not just that you look at one definition of dyslexia, you're inclusive. And if you're inclusive and you can bring everyone along with you, then you have something that's worth presenting. But also you need something that's quick, you need something that's interesting and fun for the child, and you need to empower the teachers. The teachers at the end of it need not just to score, but to understand what it was about, why they did it, and what it showed. And that is what's missed in many screeners, that at the end of it, you just have a series of numbers and you don't really understand why you did it or what it meant. And that to me is key, that you're bringing along the teachers in their understanding so that feeds in then into their intervention and support. So that's just a general statement, I think, on what's important.
Do you know what, Angela, I agree. And I think that kind of ties into the early career teacher framework and really good, robust sort of SEN training in general that Jane touched on, where, you know, Ofsted, and other organisation within the sort of statutory frameworks make sure that actually people know what to do with the screener. I happen to know, David knows, I'm sure everybody here to some degree knows how to interpret it, but if you've got standard scores of 70 versus standard scores of 110, people aren't necessarily going to have the nuanced understanding of what it means. One thing I think would be really handy to touch on is obviously inspections and accountability. Ofsted is all intertwined. So has anyone got any thoughts on kind of what an Ofsted accountability how Ofsted and increased inspections might look to improve dyslexia? Has anyone got any thoughts around Ofsted and really supporting those middle children, those year 9 girls? And Martina kind of in the chat has touched on girls manifesting differently, because if you've got boys literally kicking off because they can't access the written word, it's very different, and you can say, well, we're meeting their needs and doing this. How can an Ofsted increased inspections process kind of make schools and teachers accountable for those middle children that might get missed? Has anyone got any thoughts? Oh, Jane, go. Sorry, David, in a second.
Sorry to interrupt, David. I'm just with regard to the increased inspectors, it's really important again that those Ofsted inspectors have got a really strong understanding of SEND and dyslexia themselves. So, you know, I have been, you know, party to many inspections, and you know, sometimes, you know, not always, there are some SEND specialist inspectors, but maybe not enough. And again, it goes back to those people leading education need that knowledge and understanding. And it's about also recognizing, you know, what is good practice and where there is good practice, and how we can then share that good practice across settings. So what does good practice look like, and how is that being shared? Those were my thoughts, Helen.
Thank you, Jane. David, I'm going to go to you for the last comment because you had your hand up, and then we are going to move on to the next section. I'm just mindful of time.
Yes, absolutely. And from an Ofsted point of view, I mean, we need to remember that Ofsted inspect different organisations at different levels. So we've got school inspections, we've got local area inspections, we've got universities being looked at as well. So from a initial teacher training point of view, it would be quite easy for the framework to look specifically at that dyslexia friendly teaching in the classroom. From a school point of view, it's very easy for an Ofsted inspector to drill into SEN data. I mean, you walk into anybody who works across schools, you walk into any school and you can immediately ask to see which child was excluded last and go and have a chat with them, or you can look at the reading data and go and find the child who's at the bottom of the school's reading data, or the one who's made the most progress. It's very, very quick and easy to do that. I think the point about having SEND specialist Ofsted inspectors, I think is pertinent, and it makes a real difference, particularly where they're inspecting specialist provision. I've come across some absolutely fantastic inspectors who really do understand and really do get it, and I've also come across some that really don't. So, yeah.
Thank you. Right, so I'm gonna chop that section finished. Thank you so much, and André, thank you for your frankness, because I feel like I've put you on the spot, so thank you for kind of taking that on. I really appreciate it. So the final section, we're looking about transparency between parents and carers. Now, one of Georgina's stories that she shared, like utterly heartbreaking, was around CTF files, and part of there was a question somewhere that I read about that. So we'll hopefully touch on transfer of information through the discussion. But we're looking at just building those relationships. Central to so much policy and statutory and guidance is the voice of parents, carers, families, young people, and working as kind of a tripod around that child. So it's really important to understand how we can build up positive and functional relationships between these different stakeholders. So speaking to this part of the inquiry, we've got Brian Lamb, who he wrote a few fairly important reports over the years. He's an incredibly talented and well-known commentator on policy and things. So we'll go to Brian shortly, and also we've got Georgina Durrant, who's she's an author. She is an incredibly knowledgeable lady around SEN. She's been a secondary school teacher and a SENCO, and now she's in charge of SEN tutor in and around Cheshire. So Brian, could you give us please a brief introduction of yourself and your views around fostering transparency and ultimately positive, constructive relationships between stakeholders?
Brilliant, thank you. Thank you for that introduction. Yeah, so as people probably know, I was chair of the Lamb inquiry, which was very much about a focus on bringing parents more into the system. And indeed, not to embarrass André too much, André was one of the DFE special advisors around that, and indeed ran the 8 pilot projects with parents that did a lot to inform the way the 2014 reforms panned out. I've also worked extensively across local authorities and schools, as well as being a school governor and a special school governor. So hopefully I've seen the system from all sides, and it's very much about that tripartite arrangement between schools, the local authority and parents on delivering more for children. And just at a personal level, personal disclosure, I'm someone with dyslexia. Both my daughters had dyslexia, so I've been through the whole parental thing from the parent of dyslexia point of view as well. And it's on that, I just want to make a general point about parents within the system, that I do think, although all the measures for parents are obviously generic in the new proposals, I think parents of children with dyslexia are in a particularly challenged position sometimes as parents of children with SEN, in that the actual notion of their SEN is in itself often challenged by the system. And, you know, André referred to the debate around dyslexia. How do you identify it? Does it exist? And there has been this whole narrative right from the beginning around parents of dyslexia that is, you know, these are the sharp-elbowed middle-class parents trying to make up for the fact their children just aren't as bright as all the others. And that overlays, and that idea of middle-class access overlays whatever other resistance there sometimes still is within the system to parental engagement. So I think there is a very specific way in which parents of children with dyslexia are still positioned within that. And I have to say, I was quite shocked being on the SAS committee to see how much that narrative still informed at least some of the contributions to that committee, and that was behind some of this questioning of labelling. And so for me, it's something, I know we've got all the people on this call today will be on the side of the angels. I have to say, within the system, not everybody still is around this, as far as I can see. So that's just a very general comment, but to actually go on and try and bring together the issues of transparency and accountability. I mean, firstly, I think the new proposals in the Green Paper have been broadly around parental engagement very much welcomed, especially in terms of the strategic proposals around there being partnership boards where parents have a very clear view, where there is a local inclusion framework that they inform and feed back on, and an inclusion plan, and then the monitoring of that plan, and where there's national standards. And those are, of course, fundamental for transparency in terms of parents understanding how the system is supposed to work, what they're entitled to within that, and informing what should be available within that system. And I think that is all very much to be welcomed. If I had a concern around that, it would be how, and I think some people already raised some of this, how does dyslexia get integrated into that debate when dyslexia may be contested, both in terms of how it's identified, whether it exists and how that works. And so I'm hoping the SASC work will provide a really good underpinning for some of that later. Secondly, I have a bit of a concern. When we did the inquiry, one of the things we didn't want, we wanted parents engaged. What we didn't want was them policing the system. I do worry a little bit that some of these proposals' genesis is because the system doesn't currently work well around these issues. And the danger by having parents even more engaged on partnership boards, local authority planning, monitoring whether inclusion is going to work, is how much it starts to drag them in to processes that are more about how you monitor whether the system's working than how you ensure it's meeting their needs in the first place. The more you get parents involved in ensuring the system's meeting the needs, the less you might need the monitoring of plans and how well they're working. So I do have a little bit of a worry. And this is a question for me, that we don't, at the strategic level, make parents end up being the police of the system rather than engaging in and improving the system through that strategic planning. At the individual level, I think the proposals have been much less welcomed, to the extent that I think the idea of making mediation compulsory is very controversial. It was looked at in 2011 by the government the first time round and rejected. I think for the very good reason that actually making it compulsory undermines why mediation actually works. I'm a great fan of mediation. Don't get me wrong, I think mediation and more mediation, the better the system will be. Making it compulsory, I think, actually undermines the whole reason why mediation actually works in the first place. Restricting choice over schools, again, I understand where that's coming from and what it's being driven by in terms of the number of out-of-county placements and how appropriate those are. Again, the driver behind it, which is more appropriate local provision, I think is great, but I don't think you get there by restricting parental choice around that. You get there by making parents more confident in the system, including parents of children with dyslexia. And I think you will then see that fall away. And no amount of restriction the other end, I think, is really going to help in doing that. In terms of transparency at the school level, the school's information report, in a way, partly came out of the inquiry again, in terms of us looking at the information that parents needed was a very big part of the inquiry. I don't think it's had the effect or the leverage within the system that we had hoped for. I think there's at least some hints in the Green Paper that looking at the whole idea of what's ordinarily available in a school and what should ordinarily be provided by any school to meet their SEN needs is a really powerful concept, and I'm hoping that will be conjoined with the school's information report when the government starts to take this forward. And again, I think the key questions are, across all of this, do we have the right information and data around dyslexia locally to feed into both that school's information report and the strategic planning? Do we have the vision of what children need? Is it screening? What goes on after that? What does good look like at that local level, so that when we're looking at transparency, the issue of file transfers, what that should look like as well, and have a vision around dyslexia of what good looks like that we're asking the system to live up to in those areas. And then my last point would also be going right back to the beginning and the training and the values issue. My own personal view is, although the training is very important that people understand and the school system understands about dyslexia, I think the values point is incredibly important as well and inform the inquiry. If you have teachers that value achieving for all of their children, then a lot of the rest in terms of expertise and what follows, I think will come. Any amount of trying to force more data and information about SEN into teachers if they don't share the underlying values about wanting those children to succeed, I think can be problematic. And getting the balance, therefore, between the right amount of information going in, sometimes people forget about the values. You can't just have the values without people knowing what they're supposed to do. So I think there's a kind of tension there and you need both. I'll stop there because I'm sure I've done at least my 3 to 4 minutes, but hopefully that gives some things for people to bite on.
Thank you so much for that, Brian. I was scribbling away, so much appreciated. I think that is really important. Well, one of the things you raised that was really important was what does good look like? And I think that's where teacher training really comes in, and people knowing what to, like you said, what do we do about it? Great, we've got screeners. Now what? So thank you, that's spot on. And I'm aware of the SASC work as well, so it'd be interesting to see how that kind of develops. I'm waiting with bated breath for that, but I think you're right. If we can have an agreed meaning of dyslexia, then it's a stronger weapon, isn't it? Joe Elliott out of Durham Uni has got some very strong views on it, and I think he's got a lot of weight. So it'd be interesting to see. Very interesting. Georgina, could you give us a brief introduction of you and kind of share your thoughts on how these relationships, how these accountabilities, how schools and parents might interact together?
Yes, absolutely. So I'm Georgina Durrant. I'm a former teacher, former SENCO. I'm director of Cheshire SEN Tutor Limited, which is a tutoring service for children with SEND, and it also provides parental consultations as well. I founded the SEN Resources blog, which is a website for parents and teachers of children with SEND, and it's got a very large online following of about 30,000 people. I'm a published author in the SEN field, and my most recent book is actually about practical ways to support children with reading difficulties, such as dyslexia, early on in primary school. And I'm also host of a popular special needs podcast, which is called Sending the Experts with Georgina Durrant. So yeah, I'm in a really privileged position, both through my tutoring, through my parent consultations, and through my blog and my following on social media, that I speak to families of children with SEND and teachers and SENCOs on the ground, so to speak, pretty much every day. And when we're talking about trust in the system, which I think is really, really important, simply put, I don't think there's any way to sort of sugarcoat this. I think trust has been broken in the system, in the schools, with the local authority. I hold no blame against people, but on paper, it looks like it's going to work and that it does work, but it isn't. And it's not just families, it's lots of SENCOs as well, heads, teachers feeling this too, and I imagine the local authority. And I've hundreds of examples from my online community as to why the trust is broken, from things like, you know, the EHCPs getting lost between schools. I've heard of the example I gave you about that girl. What else have I got? Yeah, parents. I had one where a parent told me they'd reached out about support for their child with dyslexia, only to be told to Google it. And Google specific SEND instead. Parents' worries being dismissed early and nothing happening until the child is older and then in a crisis. Children being without suitable school placements, educated in corridors. I actually put out a Twitter post yesterday asking for some examples of if you've got, you know, if there is trust in the system and if there is transparency and trust in the system. And I actually couldn't read all the messages that I got last night from parents and from SENCOs of people saying, no, this is what's going on. Please, can you tell my story? Please, can you get this across? And all these anecdotes add up. And I'm certainly not blaming schools and SENCOs or the LA, but how can we expect teachers to make families trust in a system when they know it's not working the best that it is? And there's some great examples of support and care. And I think there's lots of very upset SENCOs who are doing the right things, but they've got limited resources, they've got limited time, they're losing teaching assistants to better paid professions. But in general, what's happening, I'm a bit embarrassed of it, if I'm honest. I don't think it's good enough. And I don't think there's any shortcuts to gaining this trust. I don't think there's any simple fixes. As a teacher and a parent myself, I know that trust is something you've got to gain over time, especially if you've broken it. And you build trust by showing people day in, day out, over and over again, that what you say you're going to do, you actually do. And I think the only way to rebuild the trust in the system is to actually get it right for these families and these children, for them to see over and over again that we're getting it right. So we need to be training all the staff to understand SEND properly. That's the basics, I think, that we've all agreed on, that needs to be happening. The upskilling needs to be happening. They need to be identifying this SEND earlier, like we said with the screeners. I had somebody I was tutoring a while ago, and I only spotted it because I've got my SENCO qualification, but I was tutoring somebody, just the first tutoring session. I said, do you think perhaps they could be dyslexic? And they'd gone through the whole, first half of primary school with nobody noticing. Their behaviour had deteriorated, and it wasn't until then that they then went on and were paid for the assessment. And it's things like that. If that could have been a teacher right at the start of school, rather than me as just a random person who managed to do it. And that's what's really frustrating. If everyone was upskilled, that would be happening and the trust would be there. What else have I put? So yeah, and if we talk specifically about dyslexia, because obviously this is what this is about, we need to think of the actual children and the families that we're discussing this about. And I think they get lost when we're looking at these processes. And if you think there's a child you suspect has dyslexia in primary school, whilst we're waiting to get them assessed or waiting to see what happens, which seems to be the case, what's happening to their self-esteem, their relationships, their families' relationships? There's often marriage breakdowns as a result of things like this. The implications of the wait and see approach is huge. And we've got so much at our fingertips. It's really frustrating. It's not like it's an unknown of what to do for dyslexic children. We all know what to do. It's there. We don't need to invent the technology. The technology is physically there. It might cost a bit, but I assure you a reader pen or whatever we're going to give them is going to cost a lot less than waiting until later on and they're having huge problems with mental health crises, etc. So yeah, I think we need to get it right to get the trust. I don't think there's any shortcuts.
I think that's a really salient point. Thank you, Georgina. Interestingly, I've been doing some work with a tech company. And the cost implications are huge. And David in his kind of SENCO head as well, we've spoken over the years about the cost of a reader pen versus the cost of a TA, and actually they do pay for themselves. So thank you. You've both kind of touched on mediation. One of the pre-submitted Caroline, you're absolutely right. There's a comment in the tech from Caroline folks saying that not all teachers are aware of assistive tech. At schools I've worked at, they haven't enabled the accessibility features on Microsoft Office 365. Just click the database, it's there. Some of it is so obvious. Also, Microsoft and Google and Apple, a lot of them have kind of dyslexia awareness training. So that's something that could be implemented. But I want to go to one of the pre-submitted questions, actually, because you've both touched on kind of mediation. You've both touched on empowering parents and carers, but also building bridges. So one of the questions was, given all three government given that all three of the elements of the kind of the schools bills, they aim to improve empowerment of parents. Somebody who submitted this wanted to know what processes or stages of mediation and reviews should be there. So I'm looking at the second question down. What should a process look like around setting up provision for children? Brian or Georgina, would either of you like to comment on that? Or
I think the government got it right last time in terms of mediation, by making clear to parents that it was there, making clear that it was kind of required to have considered it, but not making it compulsory to have gone through it. If you look, mediation has been more used, I think I'm right in saying, since the introduction of the legislation. It's undoubtedly successful in reducing the number of cases that go on to tribunal. That undoubtedly saves money. I think if you make it compulsory, parents then would need to be properly supported at mediation in a way that sometimes they're not at the moment. That's one of the criticisms of the way it works at the moment. You would then need, it would either be a massive imposition on the SENDIAS information services to try and support that. It would change their role in relation to that. And I think it would make parents feel that there was yet another hoop to jump through. So my answer would be that I think we've got the balance about right. I think the government could do more and local authorities could do more to promote mediation. And I think more could be done to support parents through that. But I think making it compulsory simply isn't going to work. So my answer is, what should the process be? I think we've got the right process. I go back to, again, if you've got the parental confidence, if you're having the right conversations, the only things that should be getting near mediation, let alone tribunal, are those relationships where it's completely broken down in some way, or there's some massive issue at dispute that can't be resolved any other way. And therefore, the better you get at the parental engagement and the more provision and the right sort of provision is there in the first place, then the less tribunals you'll get. And I think to some extent it shows, to me, a slight lack of confidence on the government's part that the proposal is actually going to work if they then want to also have compulsory mediation. Because if the proposals work, it should be that you will get less tribunal cases.
That's a really interesting point. Thank you. I hadn't thought of that, so thank you. Georgina, I'll come to you, and then it was David, and then Rachel and Pamela. I have seen your hands, so go for it, Georgina.
Yeah, no, I completely agree. When I first saw that the compulsory mediation bit, and I know it's compulsory to get the certificate at the moment, but not to actually go through the process. But when I saw that, it just feels like it's, I think, to parents as well, it's like he's just said, having the compulsory mediation almost looks like you already think it's not going to work, like the discussions early on aren't going to work. This is why we're going to have to compulsory have this meeting. And then the other point that I wanted to raise on that, which is more of a question really, but the SEN review says that if mandatory mediation does not prove effective in strengthening early redress, a possible additional stage called the independent review would be introduced as another mandatory step before an appeal can be lodged. And that concerns me a little bit. Like, is that going to be more delays? Is that going to be more money? How would it work? Is that, and just thinking, like I always do, about that child that's waiting and that family that's going to be under stress. And we're not just adding another, maybe someone can explain it better to me, but to me, it just feels like because it's costing more money, more delays and more impact on the family.
I do feel at times there is an element of kicking the can down the road, the budgetary can down the road. So I think that's really interesting. David, come to you, please.
Yeah, I agree with what Brian said, exactly what Brian said. I think there are two things with mediation that are tricky in addition. The first one is that my experience is that only parents who are illiterate go to mediation, and if schools submit a request for an educational healthcare plan and the parent, for whatever reason, whether it be substance abuse or chaotic life, or that they literally can't read, they often won't go to mediation, and schools aren't allowed to go to mediation. Schools aren't allowed to appeal the decision. So you end up with a situation where schools are asking parents to do it and actually doing the legwork. And I think that's something we could have a look at, because it's not just the SENDIAS service that's supporting parents. Very often it's the schools, particularly primary schools. I also am very aware that there's a lot of friction between schools and local authorities right up and down the UK. And a large part of this is around whether or not funding is agreed or whether or not EHCPs are agreed. And it's a total waste of everybody's time. And so much effort is put in arguing both directions, which should be being spent on the young people. And I wonder whether or not, if we're going to go to a funding formula and we're going to go to a nationalised EHCP, whether or not we could have a nationalised set of criteria as to when a child would get funding and when they wouldn't, because it would take all of the arguing out of the picture, and it would reduce the number of tribunals, it would reduce the number of mediation meetings required, it would take a lot of the pressure away from the parents. And I understand that you'll always have exceptional cases which are slightly different, but I mean, I've sat on panels for multiple local authorities, and the vast majority of EHCP applications or high needs funding applications look like all the others. And I think you could probably cover 90+% of them with a set of criteria or a framework, and just take all of this arguing away from the system. I think it would be beneficial for everybody.
Thank you, David. Many heads visible nodding vigorously, so thank you. Rachel and Pamela, go for it.
I was just going to say, with my kind of SENCO hat on, a lot of it is around building those relationships. If you've got those good relationships with parents right from day one as their child goes through school, then a lot of these things don't happen. You know, if an EHC is applied for instance, you're both talking from the same page, you're supporting each other in that. And I think a lot of it is about having the time to do that. So yes, we want teachers and TAs to be upskilled around SEN, but you still need that coordinator. You still need that person who is out of class. I'm talking from my own perspective because that's me. I'm a non-teaching SENCO. And I think that allows you that time to build those relationships, but it also gives you that time to build the relationships with the professionals involved with that child as well. So a lot of the medical professionals, a lot of the information that you need to support either an EHC application, a review, or any level of support, you've got those relationships and you've built them. So yes, we need to upskill all the teachers working with those children, but you still need somebody who's going to coordinate that role and build those relationships.
I wholeheartedly agree. I'm on there's a Facebook SENCO group. I can't remember, but obviously I'm not a SENCO anymore. I have been, and it literally broke me because of what you pulled in a bajillion directions. It broke me. I cannot do that job. I can't cope. So you know, that's my disclosure. Yeah. And I think what's really important to note is the Bath Spa Uni SENCO, the workload survey by Helen Curran. I happened to message her before this because I thought I saw her last week, obviously Wiltshire. The work, when you look at what is expected, that survey says is needed time-wise for kind of X number of EHCPs, X number of children, various permutations. And then when you look on the SENCO page on Facebook, about what time people don't have, and I'm very explicit with what they don't have, and it's a resources squeeze, and it's so hard. You've all said it's about the relationship. If you are a teaching SENCO, I was a teaching SENCO and I was lucky with mine. If you're a teaching SENCO and you've got to be in 46 different places at once and you've got 3 bajillion different phone calls, you haven't got capacity, and sadly as a SENCO you're the face of it all. The stress is horrendous. Brian, I'm mindful of your hand, go for it.
Just to say, I accept all that around the capacity of teachers and SENCOs to do this, but also if we're looking at ITT and training, there is no model, and often no training as ITT or follow-up in schools on working with parents. We just somehow assume that the workforce will know how to work with parents. when we established Achievement for All, there was a whole model around that called the structured conversation, which was training for teachers and professionals about how to work in a very focused way with parents. Some teachers and some professionals think is absolutely brilliant at doing it. They just naturally are. But we just assume the workforce can do this. And so what we focus on is the content bits about how this particular SEN needs impacts people's learning. But if we're saying that working with parents is fundamental to getting the system right, and then we don't train professionals in how, what are the models, what are the good, what's good in all of that. We just assume somehow folk are going to do it because they're empathetic or they're good, and that's why they've gone into teaching in the first place. And actually we shouldn't. There are models of what good looks like in this area, but we don't develop those, we don't require them.
Thank you so much. Again, I love these things because everybody, this is why these sessions are so important. Different people, different brains, different foci, different backgrounds. So we have that is such a solid point. I hadn't even crossed my mind. So thank you. Thank you. Are there any other hands up around this particular question? I can't see any hands up on all the different screeny bits. Because one thing I wanted to come back about kind of building bridges and connections. David mentioned parental illiteracy. There's been various comments around digitized EHCPs and tech. Now, if you're an illiterate parent and most people will have a phone in an ideal world, not again, COVID realized how the digital divide is huge. Do you think that there's some potential for a digitized EHCP to be more accessible? Because my emails get read out to me. You've seen me try and read. I'm like, and has anyone got any thoughts on that? Could actually a digital one be better for people that can't read or struggle with reading? Georgina, there's a hand gone, go for it.
Yeah, so I put a post about this out on Twitter. I think you saw it, Helen, asking the same thing, like what were people's points of view on it? And accessibility was a huge point for a lot of people, that they were very, very concerned that parents wouldn't be able to access it, and how we're going to actually help those people who can't access them online. What are they going to be disadvantaged again? Or what are we going to actually do? Because printing it off isn't going to help. Like, how are we going to help these people with that? So I do think accessibility, I think a lot of people like the idea of a consistent format, obviously not the same easy, but like a consistent format, as long as it's not got like drop down menus or anything like that, as long as it's got the scope for people to write lots of information, so you've got a holistic view of the child. I think people like that, but the problem was just with this accessibility. And also people were very concerned about so much information being trusted online. Like, there's a lot of very sensitive information about children that would be held on these systems, and I think a lot of people were concerned about who was accessing them, how that was going to happen. But I imagine that would have been considered.
I've got the Bathness, a local authority by me. They do a lot online, and I keep getting random emails saying a child's EHCP has been adjusted. I happen to work with this child, but it's old emails, so there is wobbles. And that, before I bring anything else in, does anybody have any thoughts around a digitized EHCP process? Are there any other hands going up? Not that I can see. Right. So I suppose that kind of does link to the sort of the transparency of how is information sent between schools. I know from having worked in schools that the CTF files, word finding difficulties with dyslexia, the CTF files don't always work, and when they do sort of half work, you might as well just have a piece of paper, like Georgina said. Sometimes data goes wrong, and sometimes data goes catastrophically and heartbreakingly wrong. So the information, the question that's asked, and I refer back to the first of the pre-submitted questions, is how can parents and carers have better access to common transfer files during the transition period? And I think I would draw that to the reliability of the transfer and what is sent. Has anyone got any thoughts around that?
No. My concern as well is if you have it too like technologically focused that you're losing the actual. I'd hate for people to rely on that information being shared electronically and not have the additional meetings, and that, because that's what makes it. I was a secondary SENCO, you've got to meet with the primary SENCO, you've got to meet with the parents.
Yes.
All of that has to happen, and I'd hate for people to think, oh well, it's been transferred and all this information has gone across, so we know it's there, but those meetings, it can't replace physical one-to-one meetings with people.
Absolutely. Sometimes a chat is worth 1,000 emails, and a chat is worth all the paper it's written on. Rachel and Pamela, you've got your hands up as well. Go.
Sorry, I was just going to say the same thing as Georgina, that it's those meetings that you actually have in school with the SENCOs from the secondary schools. I'm primary at the moment, and I think those, they're worth so much, because it's the discussion. It's like this. It isn't just telling somebody the information. By being asked for information, by chatting around a subject, so much more is learned about that.
It's
than
that
what you
dialogue.
could ever give in a file. Yeah, totally.
A monologue's dead boring. A dialogue is hugely important, and I think Ryan,
it's also, sorry, it was also going back to building those relationships again now. I know I'm like a track record.
No, I agree.
Relationships between SENCOs and trusting each other, and sort of, you know, being able to have that exchange of information, but trusting that it's good information. And I think it's all about that relationship building.
Thank you. Brian, you've got your hand up as well. Go for it.
Yeah, it was just slightly more philosophical point off the back of that, because I mean, I totally agree, you know, and that's totally in line with the code of practice and what it says you're supposed to do about meeting with parents, sharing the issues, agreeing a joint plan, taking that forward. So if all of that's happening, the question occurs, well, why is there a problem? What is the issue? And I think this brings up a more philosophical problem about what you stipulate in legislation. And so for the inquiry, what you're asking for people to legislate versus what do people go away and practice and actually do? And do they understand that this isn't just some performative requirement? Oh yes, you have to meet with the parents 3 times a year. Goodness me, what's all that about? Tick the box. Versus, what is the purpose of meeting with those parents? What are you trying to do about conveying the information, agreeing a plan, doing something together that means that whether it's electronic or not, they're getting the right information conveyed in the right place. The right information is going to other people within the system at the right time. And therefore, the kind of issues that you were sharing earlier shouldn't really be happening. But again, do you achieve that through the values and the training, or do you achieve it by performatively requiring people to do certain things? And if you do they understand what they're doing? So it's a much broader philosophical point. I don't know how helpful it is.
But Brian, it's a fundamental point. The value systems. Good old Bourdieu. I'm a Bourdieu scholar. Like it's the cultural capital. It's the culture of the system you're working in. I think that's beautifully put. Ticky boxy irritates people if they don't know why. Yeah. And I think you've just encapsulated probably the entire session between you guys in that last few minutes. And I'm mindful of time, actually, we are coming to the close. But I think what's really, really key, central to all of it, is the child. And what I've really liked, what I've really valued listening to everybody else who's so clever, so incredibly accomplished, is we centralise the child. There's paperwork, there's faff, there's noise. There is a child, a young person, slap bang in the middle of all this, and they should be the ones centralised. The delays are not good enough. I think we all agree that the delays in EHCPs, the time frame of 6 months, that's nonsensical. It's too long. The delay, and then when you've got authorities that are in breach of those, it's not good enough. And then centralising again, kind of there's the first layer is the child, that's the kernel, and then kind of moving out, there's the parents and the team around the child. So because, like people have raised, families, if a child has dyslexia, there's probably other people in that family who have wobbles, who will struggle to access things. So the fact that as professionals here, as bods with different fingers in different pies, we are all focusing on children and then families is brilliant, and relationships. And I think the values that underpin those relationships, as Brian just nailed, are what's absolutely crucial. And I think listening to each other, it's very easy to just go, well, I'm doing this and I'm important, I'm in my role, I've got my head down and go. We're human, we've all done it, we all will do it, we are human, but it's it's that focus on the child. Has anyone else got anything they'd like to add? There's a couple of comments that have appeared. Thank you. We have 5 minutes. So has anyone got anything they'd like to add, just because we've got four-ish minutes now, or any hands going up? You're all quiet. I don't think I've ever seen anyone so quiet.
I do have one thing.
Thank you, Dominic, go for it.
It's more about future work. My background's in technology and things of that form. We've just come out of a period where a very large number of children have been subject to remote learning with varying degrees of success. Now, it strikes me, having taught, although not dyslexic people, I've taught a very international group of people, and some of them have learned rather more effectively in an electronic world than from traditional teacher at the front telling them things. And I'm just wondering, is anyone gathering evidence and best practice for both children as a whole and children with dyslexia that would allow them to do remote access? Because it would allow us to deliver tailored help much more cheaply. We're always going to have a finite budget of resources, but if children can do things from screens, perhaps to remote tutors or what have you, and with other technology, I'm just wondering whether there is any.
There are. I've got 2 papers in review that I need to pull my finger out and do. I am one person. Yeah. But equally, actually, what's really pioneering, there's 2 places that I focus on, and I've got a real interest in this because it's a bee in my bonnet. Uruguay has the El Plan Ceibal, which is a national plan where every kid in a state school since 2009 has had access to a laptop, but it's bigger than that. It basically is an actual useful embodiment and enactment of the 2019 UK digital strategy. So they've got fundamental structural, and I mean legislative structural change, and it's acting and it's working. They've got published review papers. I'm looking into that. Other people are as well. I'm not the only one, but a lot of it's Spanish language. I speak Spanish. Not every researcher in the English world does. And Wales are updating a lot of their practice. Their digital literacy curriculum is written by a guy called Professor Tom Crick. He knows his stuff, and he works with a woman, an incredibly accomplished woman called Catherine Knight, who does a lot of work around dyslexia. So in Wales, there's a lot happening. I'm sure Angela Fawcett could speak more, or Amanda Kirby could speak more to a lot of the research going on. But there is a lot happening. The publication process takes a bajillion years around university processes, but there is work coming out now. So, and I agree with you. Angela said Angela's just about to publish one as well. So she's just written that in the chat. Nice one. Well done. We have got like literally a minute. I don't know if Chamber are going to come in and say something as well. I think I want to publicly acknowledge the incredible hard work of Anne-Marie Debner, who has put this session together. I did not do this. She has done this in liaison with people from the BDA. This is not my baby. This is hers, and she's brilliant. She's been a joy to work with over the last few weeks. So public credit for her. She needs it. She's brilliant. And thank you everybody else for all your amazing contributions. What a privilege to kind of engage with this. So I'm going to mute, and Anne-Marie will probably be able to say more about what will happen next. Thank you, everybody.
Absolutely. And Helen, you've been the best chair that we could have ever wished for. I mean, your seminal contributions and the panelists as well, from Brian Lamb to Rachel and Pamela, from Georgina. I mean, everyone that we've had, and David and so forth. We're so grateful for your seminal contributions. I've just been scribbling away. I'm very much of a fetus in the educational fora of policy. So I'm very much grateful for understanding about the specifics of training, transparency, accountability and funding, access, so forth. So what happens next? Essentially, I'm going to type up a report about this and this write-up and seeing what's best practice that's been put forward. In terms of another inquiry session, the 4th will be happening sometime in October, and that will be on working age adults. So that will have a criminal justice perspective as well as just workplace and the employment sector. So that will also look at the Qualities Act as well, and what people in the workplace need and so forth, and just seeing the reforms that are needed for neurodivergent staffing. The criminal justice sector one is something that I find quite exciting. It will also focus on potential, I know we talked about behavioural issues and that triaging children outside of mainstream schooling because they're not being diagnosed. Having a lot of exciting conversations with Professor Amanda Kirby about, for example, PRUs, having children outside of mainstream schooling. So it's just genuinely an interesting topic. So we'll be releasing tickets for that later on in about 2 to 3 weeks, and we'll just keep the conversation going, and this will be collated into a healthy report that Matt and other parliamentarians will look when we're seeing what policy works and what needs to be reformed. I thank also to the audience as well, who have been incredible and just participating in this healthy conversation. And again, massive thank you to the panelists and to our wonderful, wonderful chair, Matt, but especially the most wonderful chair that we could have ever had, Helen Ross. Thank you so much.